Which side of your brain do you think with? Now you might think I'm asking if you're more logical or creative, but it's actually a myth that some people are more left-brained or right-brained than others. In fact, I asked a bit of a trick question because in our day-to-day lives, we are always using both sides of our brain. But that doesn't mean that the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain don't do different things. For example, when we process language by speaking out loud or trying to remember a word, most people use the left side of the brain more than the right. On the other hand, when we do spatial reasoning, by trying to cut a piece of cake perfectly in half or attempting to solve a Where's Wally, most people use the right side of the brain more than the left. But that's most people, not everyone. Some people have a flipped pattern of right language and left spatial, and others still use the same side of the brain for both language and spatial reasoning. Now, there is some evidence that people who have dyslexia, developmental language delays, and autism are less likely to have the typical pattern of left language and right spatial. Does that mean that not having the typical pattern impacts the development of language and spatial abilities? That's what I'm trying to figure out for my PhD. To answer this question, I invited hundreds of 3 to 7-year-old children to come into the lab to find out which side of their brain they think with. We did this using technology called functional transcranial Doppler ultrasound, which you can see being worn by the young man here. Essentially, this is a hat with 2 ultrasound probes attached to it, which sit on the sides of the face. If we angle these probes just right, we can detect changes in brain activity within each side of the brain. I created 2 computer games for our kids to play while wearing the hat, which let us find out which side of their brain they use to create language and which side of the brain they use for spatial reasoning. My results show that, on average, the more typical a child's pattern is, that is, the closer they are to having left language and right spatial, the better their language and spatial skills are. This research helps us to understand how different patterns of brain activity might act as risk factors for impairments in language and spatial abilities. They also help us to understand not only how we use the 2 halves of our brain differently, but also how the 2 halves of our brain work together to perform more complex tasks like reading. So, the next time someone asks you which side of your brain you think with, tell them it's not a matter of which, it's how you use the 2 halves of your brain that matter.